And welcome back to the Law News Network, everyone. I'm your host for the afternoon, Caroline Polisi, and we are officially on verdict watch in the Frank Bybee case. That, of course, is the case out of Florida with former Sheriff's Deputy Frank Bybee. He is on trial for attempted murder of the alleged victim, Marcia Soul. But I want to talk a little bit about this fascinating interview that LawNewz's editor-in-chief here, Rachel Stockman, just had with Lisa Bloom. I'm sure our viewers are very well aware at this point of that bombshell New York Times story breaking the news about Harvey Weinstein's alleged decades-long history of sexual harassment allegations that have allegedly been covered up by the company until now. One of those allegations came from famous actress Ashley Judd. Weinstein subsequently issued a somewhat opaque apology, but his lawyer, Lisa Bloom, has stated that many of the accusations in the Times story are in fact false. We were very fortunate to have Lisa Bloom here in studio today with Rachel Stockman, and she said some very interesting things about this case. I took some notes during the case, and one of the things that she said is that everything about this case is unusual, and every way that Harvey is handling this case is unusual, and maybe that's the way it should be. She maintained she was still a passionate representative for women's rights, and she stated that, Harvey, she said, he chose me for a reason, and I think that says something. Very interesting stuff. They also talked about how Harvey is not going to be going after the victims here, so to speak. That's not sort of their tactic in this case. But Weinstein is, in fact, going to bring a defamation case against the New York Times. Lisa Bloom stating, quote, "Our beef is with the New York Times," end quote, not with the victims. And she went into detail about saying about how they really refused to take into consideration witnesses that they had given them. They refused to sort of mention their side of the story. It's a complex story, she said. There are a dozen of allegations. If this were actually in litigation, the way it would shake out is that some of them would prove to be true, some of them would prove to be false, but the Times story just presented it one-sided. Charles Harder and Harvey Weinstein feel that there is a strong case of defamation here. They were unfairly treated, and some of these facts are going to come out as wrong. I, just as an attorney, will say that truth is a complete defense against any defamation claim. So that's going to play a key role here. A very interesting interview with Lisa Bloom by our LawNewz's Rachel Stockman. So that was a real treat. We are on verdict watch, again, for the former Sarasota County Sheriff's Deputy Frank Bybee, who's charged with attempted murder and exploitation of an elderly. The alleged victim in that case is Marcia Soul, quite a character. We heard from Ms. Soul. We did not hear from Mr. Bybee. The jury now has Mr. Bybee's fate in their hands, and we will hear from them. Maybe we'll hear from them today. I would doubt it, but nonetheless, they are deliberating. I now want to remind our viewers about a trial that we are gearing up to cover here at LawNewz. Very exciting. And we have a special segment for you today on LawNewz with this very high-profile case, the case of Jessica Chambers. Now, the name likely rings a bell to our viewers, and that is because this was the case of the 19-year-old Mississippi native who was found burning alive at the side of a highway next to her own car. And the hunt for her killer really has captivated this nation since 2014. Quentin Tellus will stand trial for her murder, and openings in that case begin next Tuesday, October 11th. We will be covering the trial gavel to gavel here at LawNewz, and everyone's very excited. We have a very special guest here today, Therese Apel. I wasn't, it rhymes with maple. I wanted to get it right. Therese, thank you so much for being here. Therese is a journalist with the Clarion Ledger. She's been covering this case from the very beginning. And Therese, I just want to start by showing our viewers a clip of the last known sighting of Jessica Chambers before she was found on that roadside highway. I believe she's at a gas station around 6:30 p.m. the night that the alleged incident happened. And so I want to, if we could play that, guys, could we play that clip? There it is. There she is. So you'll see young Jessica get out of her car. See if she's coming up here. Again, this is the last time anybody has seen Jessica Chambers since she was found later that evening burning alive. There she is. She stops. She does talk to someone. She goes into the convenience store. And she's getting a drink for herself, I believe. We'll keep that up there. So Therese, thank you for being with us here today.
It's good to be here.
Can you sort of take us back to that night? So take us back to what authorities say happened after this footage that is up on our screen now that our viewers are watching. What took place?
Well, what we know at this point is very much different than what we knew back then.
Right.
Basically, people knew that she had gone into that store. That was the last time anybody had seen her. She talked to a clerk there. She talked to some friends there. And as they went through this footage that we saw, there were other people throughout that video that, of course, immediately became suspects because the question was, who was she with last?
Right.
Quentin Tellus was somebody that throughout the case never drew a lot of attention. And it did turn out once they indicted him and once they began to question him, he did admit that he was with her that night. And I think at one point he even said something to the effect that he may have been the last person that was with her that night. What happened between them is not at this point clear, but I'm sure will come out in trial. But what we know about their relationship is that they were involved in a romantic relationship, and that they believe that that's what led to Jessica's death.
Now, how close in time was that romantic relationship? And I read somewhere that they actually attended the same high school. They were they grew up together. Is that true?
Everyone in Cortland grew up together because it's so small. They were a few years apart. I want to say it's about 5 or 6 years apart. So they probably knew of each other long before this, but I believe they weren't actually involved with each other until about 2 weeks before the homicide.
2 weeks.
And that's why I think another reason that he was kind of not really on the radar at first.
Right. And do we know anything about that relationship? You said it was romantic in nature. Were they boyfriend, girlfriend? Do we know anything more about that?
Jessica had a lot of acquaintances. She had a lot of friends, a lot of boyfriends. She did have one primary boyfriend that was in prison at the time. His name is Travis Sanford. So the status, to put it in Facebook terms, of Jessica and Quentin, I think is in question. And there at one point was some question as to whether that may have been the reason that he would have snapped on her if he were the one who did this.
Interesting. Now, there is a very interesting twist in this case having to do with Quentin, and that is sort of how he was first in custody. Can you tell us a little bit about this additional information we have about Quentin?
Sure. Quentin went at some point from Panola County, which is where he was from. He had gotten out of prison just a few months before, I think in October, right before Jessica was killed. And he ended up going to Louisiana with a woman that he knew down there. He ends up dating her and marrying her. On the day they get married, the body of a young woman is found in her apartment. They said it was a really horrible scene. She had been stabbed to death over 30 times. And I think they said, if I'm not mistaken, all but one of the stabs were non-fatal. As that case progressed, it turned out that it looked like she had been tortured for her PIN card number. And then the last stab was probably either when she gave it up or when her killer was finished with her. Some neighbors started to talk about what they had seen, and she and Quentin Tellus had become friends. At some point they had met at Walmart, and they had started to be associated in some way that I am not clear on, but he did have access to her apartment. So I do know that they were friends, and that I can't speculate on that. But the point is, he quickly became a suspect because a 7-cent receipt on one of her debit cards was found in his home, along with a lot of other evidence that police had down there. He ended up being indicted in her murder as well, which of course set off a whole lot of questions in addition to what we already had in the Jessica Chambers case.
And just from a chronological point of view, when was that indictment?
The indictment on that was when he was indicted in February of 2016 in the Chambers case. He was sitting in jail in Louisiana on the credit card charges in that case down there. Then when he was brought up here, he was indicted in the Louisiana case in the murder shortly after he got up here. So it's been kind of one of those things where a lot of the question has revolved around who will ultimately get him. If he is convicted in both of these murders, who gets him? And it looks like either way, it may be Louisiana is where he ends up assuming that he is guilty of these two crimes.
Right, and it is a capital case. Am I right about that?
It is.
Yeah.
And he was, on the credit card charges, he was sentenced as a habitual offender in Louisiana. He was convicted of those credit card charges. So that means that no matter what happens here, he will spend the rest of his life in prison in Louisiana, and no matter if he's convicted of the murder down there as well.
Now, I remember watching this case too. I remember Nancy Grace was covering it. There were a lot of, as you alluded to in the beginning of our segment, a lot of alternate theories having nothing to do with Quentin Tellus. How was it that police landed upon this lead, if you will, and what were some of the previous theories that they had come up with in this case?
Well, I'm not privy to a lot of the previous theories, but there was one that I actually knew about firsthand because I had put something on Twitter that said, somebody out there knows what happened to Jessica. Mm-hmm. Can you just send me an email? And I got an email from a guy who said, he was in Iowa, I believe, and he said that his friend said her boyfriend had killed Jessica Chambers. The guy that was in question had said he had been involved in a homicide in Panola County, and he had fled to where they were. Long story short, when they finally were able to pin him down, he had been involved in a drive-by the night before that he thought that the victim had died. And so he was not actually the suspect in the Chambers case. But when the girlfriend heard him say he had killed someone down there, she Googled. And of course, Jessica Chambers was what came up because of her case. So that was one that I think we all, I say we all being everybody associated with the case, I was very excited about it because obviously if you think you can be a part of finding the killer in a case like this, it's a huge thing. But he was not the one. I know they had 4 specific leads. Again, I wasn't privy to the others, but that took them to Tennessee, to Iowa, to Louisiana, and into Alabama as they researched this case. The case, because there was so little street chatter, it centered a lot more on things like forensics, cell phones, that kind of thing. And that was how ultimately it led to Quentin Tellus, if I'm not mistaken. I believe the initial link to him came back to her cell phone activity.
Way back when, again, I remember in 2014, can you verify whether or not there's any veracity to, there was sort of this lore going around that sort of Jessica's last breath, she named her killer. Do we know, can we verify if that's actually the truth or not?
Well, she said something. And the tricky part is that she had been on fire. And if you know anything about how fire works in airway burns, we assume that she was probably out when she was set on fire, and that when you wake up in that kind of pain, you take a deep breath, and she would have inhaled all that heat. They were saying that she said something like Eric or Derek.
Right.
Think about the mechanics of your mouth, if it's swollen and burned, and if it was going through all the things that she no doubt was, it would sound a lot like Eric or Derek if you said Tellus. And that's one of the things that was speculated about when his name came up, is perhaps it was just because of this. I do know that she had severe airway burns. I don't know ultimately what she said or that, but the lore was that she had said Eric or Derek. So there were several Erics, Dereks. I think there was a Jarek that they brought in for questioning because they wanted to, see if that was the correct name.
I remember that there were some sort of gang leaders named Eric or Derek really coming out of the woodwork and saying, look, I had nothing to do with this, wanting to proactively sort of claim their innocence because so much was made of this alleged sort of deathbed, the last word that she stated. You mentioned that her airways were extremely burned, and I want to talk a little bit about, again, another piece of information that's been floating around here is that there was in fact lighter fluid poured down her nose, her air pipes, things of that. Can you give us any information about that?
That is absolutely untrue, and it was debunked shortly after the case started, but I think there was a lot of interesting internet activity associated with this case that I had never, and I've been a crime reporter now for 7 years at the Clarion Ledger, and before that had covered general assignment, but a lot of crime where I was before. Long story short, I've never seen the internet weigh in so much and carry so much weight when it comes to what people think happened. And that was, of course, probably my first introduction to fake news.
Yep.
Now, the thing about the lighter fluid, it's wrong off the bat because the accelerant that was used was gasoline. Secondly, again, those airway burns are believed to have come from when she took that deep gasp when she came to, when the pain from the fire probably woke her up.
Okay. Was there any type of sexual element? Was there evidence of a sexual assault as well, or no?
I am not honestly able to answer that. I believe at some point I was told that he said that there was, but I'm not. I'm not confident in that at this point.
Yeah. Again, there's so many rumors out there flying. We just want to sort of get our facts straight here. Of course, we will find out soon enough. But take me to Cortland, Mississippi, where Jessica's family still resides. I heard an interview with her father saying that they really believes that God's law is going to prevail in this case, whatever, regardless of what happens here on this earth. Can you give us a sense of how the family is dealing with not only the tragic murder of their daughter, but now the upcoming trial for Quentin Tellus?
I think the interesting thing about this family is, and when you've seen a lot of grieving families, there are dynamics that are throughout. In their family, I've never seen some people who just seem so vulnerable in their grief. And her father at one point told me that he hoped that whoever had done it ended up in prison because he knew people would take care of him there. I mean, that's a grieving father, just feeling what you feel when you lose a child. Her mother, I sat down with her last year and did a pretty in-depth interview, and I don't think will ever be the same. I mean, which I guess makes sense for any mother who's lost a child. But one of the things that she told me that I can't imagine hearing as a mother was that when she went to see Jessica as she was in the hospital on the respirator, she knew how bad off she was. And she actually told her as she sat there, "We're all here. We all love you. We don't want you to suffer. You can go if you need to." And that was when Jessica died. Wow. So there are a lot of things they've been through. I think 3 birthdays, 3 Christmases, and that was Jessica's favorite, holiday. And that was one of the things she said really hit her hard when I talked to her. On Facebook, you can see them, dealing and grieving and posting things that go along with it. But after the indictment, they stopped talking to the media because they didn't want to cause any trouble for the upcoming trial. And the DA said that was probably the best thing. That said, I know that once this is over, I'm sure they'll have plenty to say because this has been such an ordeal for them. And they've been very, I guess, forced to be public in their grieving.
Absolutely. Just want to ask one more question about whether or not, again, some other theories floated in this case is that this was potentially a drug deal gone wrong. What do we know about the past of both the victim and the alleged perpetrator of this crime? And what's your thought on that theory?
Jessica was as we talked about, she was a very social person. She had a lot of friends and a lot of boyfriends. When they actually deconstructed her phone call list, it led to 22,000 other phone numbers that they had to look into.
Wow.
Because of the nature of some of her associations. There was an operation called Bite Back that the FBI did where they took some of the crimes that were uncovered during the forensic process on her cell phone records, just following the chain of evidence when you look at the next phone and the next phone. And they actually arrested 17 people for drug and gang activity, none in her homicide at that point, but just because they were able to unearth these other crimes. That came from the information they had as they looked into the Chambers case. Now, the thing about Jessica was that she knew so many people. Quentin was someone who has been validated as an insane vice lord. He had spent time in prison. He was, somebody that was very, very, he didn't have a lot of friends. So as I understand it, some of the alibis he used up front fell through because the people that he tried to use hardly even knew who he was. It was one of those things where that's where his thread started to unravel, as it were. My feeling is that they probably did have some dealings with drugs. I'm not at this point privy to what they would have been. But that said, just because of the way the case has centered around some of these types of folks, my feeling is that yes, there was absolutely some kind of drug activity going on. I don't think they did a bad deal between the two of them. I don't think that's the reason that she was killed.
Okay. Trial is coming up in this case. Of course, openings are expected to be next Tuesday. What is the feeling in the air in Mississippi? What's sort of the community sense down there in terms of whether or not there's going to be a conviction in this case, whether or not this man is actually guilty of this crime?
I think there's a lot of questions about why the defense is still going forward with the case, because there has been so much confidence on the side of the prosecution that yes, we've got our guy. Yes, we have, the information that we need. We have the evidence that we need. So of course the defense attorneys aren't talking. So I don't know what they've got in their pocket. But because there were, some questions about other suspects early in the case, obviously that could be kind of what they're getting at. Now, when you talk about Cortland, I've spoken to some people in Panola County in the last week who they are ready for this to be over. Yeah. They have, grieved her for so long, and they have lived in fear. And not only that, you put a town of, 450 or whatever it is. It's been a while since I've looked it up. But you put them under a national microscope like this, and it has caused so many of these people that when I first went there were happy to talk to us. We're, glad we were there. Just help us, find this killer. Now you walk in and they see you and they say, no, I'm sorry, I own a business. I can't say anything to you. So they're living under a real, heavy weight until this case is over. Statewide, I think everyone is familiar with this case because of the amount of exposure that it got. And I think, of course, like any other case, you've got the ones that say, no, he didn't do it, and the ones that say, yes, he did. And then you've got basically everybody who wants justice for her, one way or the other.
Do we know anything about potential witnesses for the prosecution's case? For example, Tellus's wife, do we know if she's going to testify, or have you heard anything about sort of the case in chief?
I have not heard who they're calling. At one point, I had heard there could be as many as 40 prosecution witnesses. Now, that said, I don't know how accurate that is because, the district attorney also was not giving interviews in the last few weeks leading up to this, too, as they prepared for the case. I do know that some of the investigators that work the forensics on this case will definitely be key. And I believe there was a friend of Jessica's that was with her throughout most of that last day of her life that I believe will probably be called and will be a substantial witness as well.
Wow. Well, Therese, thank you so much for your insights. We're all here at LawNewz incredibly excited to cover this trial, and your insights are very helpful to us here. Therese Apel, everybody, thank you so much for being on the LawNewz Network.
Thank you for